Okay, have you actually thought about how strange some myths are? Aphrodite springs from the white foam of Uranus's genitals fully formed, or the world is on the back of a turtle, or the world is born from the body of a dead god, their bones becoming the mountains, their flesh the trees, and the whole universe is made from water and held together with duct tape. Or what about the legends of those who join my Patreon down at the link in the description below, or pick up my books, On Writing and Worldbuilding Volumes 1 to 3 if you love this video, you'll love this book, or read my book, A Catalogue for the End of Humanity with a ton of amazing world building. The legends I've heard of those demigods, unbelievable. Okay, calm down. The reality is a lot of these stories aren't all that different from like God creating Eve from the rib of Adam. We're just used to that one. But there are reasons we tell strange stories about how the world came to be. Take a look at these two very different Chinese creation stories about how humans came into existence. In one story, the god Pan Ku builds the sky higher and higher for 18,000 years until eventually he dies. And the world comes from his body, but the humans grow from the fleas in his hair. In contrast, in some Han, Kazakh, and Lahu myths, humans were sculpted by the gods from mud or wood or perhaps bamboo or other plants mixed together, except one variation of this says that the nobles were made from, quote, yellow earth, while the peasants were made from red dirt. Mythology isn't just an attempt at pseudo-history, which is often how we approach it in writing fiction, fantasy, and sci-fi. More importantly, they're also about passing down a moral, social, or philosophical commentary about us and the world, and we use metaphor and storytelling to do that as a way to make the complex simple and memorable. These creation stories are both quirky, but they each say something different about humanity and the world. And when we use metaphors, sometimes they can be a little weird, especially when we're not used to that kind of imagery. You could say the first myth is aimed at explaining our relationship with the divine. Disembodied or dead gods show up a lot in creation stories. Hindu, Aztec, Norse, Babylonian, Chinese, some Inuit, so many more. It's no surprise they keep showing up in the stories we tell as well, of the 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin, Final Fantasy XIV, or the Nevernight Chronicles where a city is built into the skeleton of a godlike creature, Perdido Street Station by China Mayville, which writes, beneath the towering bleached ribs of a dead ancient beast lies the city of New Crabuzon. Fantastic book, by the way. But more importantly, these images keep showing up because visceral metaphors can be a powerful statement, like the death of a god. It can speak to how truly beautiful things can only come from sacrifice, or that in creating something in art, we need to give a part of ourselves to it. It can signify sacrificial love or the old order giving way to the new, that something needs to die in order for something to come in its place. But on the other hand, saying that we are the fleas on the body of a dead god can speak to our insignificance, to our parasitic nature. We are only feasting on the corpse of something far greater. We are but an afterthought, perpetuating ourselves by taking from something else. A god's death can be a parallel to our own mortal lives, an assurance that all things must die, and that death is a natural part of life, even for the gods themselves, and yet beautiful things may come from it, like us. The death of a god can be the death of what they represent, justice, order, sameness. It can be used to explain the lack of something in this world. Maybe in a desert world which was once green, the god of water was killed thousands of years ago. After all, killing a god is tantamount to killing the very world they represented and upheld. Dead gods can be used to explain why places or items or weapons or even humans are special because they contain something of that dead god. They echo some higher existence, and in fantasy and sci-fi, that might even be true. In N.K. Jemisin's The 100,000 Kingdoms, there's this goddess of death, Anefa, who is killed and only her heart remains of her, known now as the Stone of Earth. It looks barely like a lump of dirt, but some people are able to use it to gain great power, to regenerate damaged flesh, even revive themselves from death. In other stories, the majesty of a mountain range is explained by being the spine of a dead god, or the beauty of gemstones, how special and rare and precious they are, is explained by being the leftover blood of a god. In another Chinese myth, gemstones are actually the bone marrow of Pan Ku. The reality is, we don't necessarily know what people entirely intended in telling this story, what meaning they took from it about Pan Ku and humans. What did fleas mean to them in the day? What did hair mean to them in the day? Which parts of the story about Pan Ku did they emphasize or minimize? Are they referring to some kind of other imagery? And what knowledge did people from the day have that we might have lost? A lot of history is educated guesswork at layers of meaning to these stories that we have to infer infer from other sources and historical context, cultural and metaphorical meaning which may not have survived even if the belief or the scripture did, especially if the story was only written down centuries after the belief began, or we can't tell where myth ends and history begins. Like, hypothetically, if Panku was the founder of their civilization, it would change how we read this metaphor. These layers of complexity can be really fun to play with in your story, and believe it or not, the Elder Scrolls, like, yes, the one that has Skyrim, not particularly that game, but the rest of the series actually has some amazingly deep mythological lore. Like, listen to the creation story of the Yukudans. As Sakatal ate itself over and over, the stronger spirits learned to bypass the cycle by moving at strange angles. They called this process the walkabout, a way of striding between the world skins. Ruptger was so big that he was able to place the stars in the sky so that weaker spirits might find their way easier. See, the Yukudan homeland sank beneath the waves Atlantis-style ages ago, meaning much of their civilizational memory was lost, and with that, a lot of the context and meaning for these metaphors we've got here. What does it mean to move at strange angles? What does the name Ruptger mean in the original language? And what are we actually describing in him placing stars in the sky to guide others? Much of the cultural memory required to understand these references and stories was lost when Yukuda sank, leading to this strangely disembodied mythology, which says something about how the Yukudans view the nature of reality, but we only have part of the picture. Especially when you add in the hints that the Yukudans might be from a previous universe, maybe, and that there's real fictional history and fictional mythological history being mixed in together here. Because a lot of the time we are actually talking about real historical events of some kind. The Yukudan mythology is, on some level, true. Alternatively, these stories aren't so much metaphorical as they are real attempts at naturalism, at understanding how the universe came to be, but it's really hard to know where that line always is. And our genuine attempts at naturalism can still betray a worldview. A belief the sun revolves around the earth might be people truly trying to figure out how the universe works. It doesn't have to be a metaphor, but maybe it still tells us something about what you think of our existence here. We are special. But you can do a lot with this kind of world building, leaving disembodied myths whose metaphors have been lost to time, but hint at some greater picture, whose commentary only makes sense in a particular cultural context, or whose linguistic metaphorical meaning only makes fully sense in the original lost language, where the line between historical event and naturalism and metaphorical truth all get blurred. Ursula K. Le Guin conjures this feeling fantastically in her Earthsea stories. There are all these organic creation stories from different cultures, like the Twin Gods, or rituals like the Long Dance, stories like the myth of making, which is recounted in this ancient song that people remember, but we don't really know where it fully comes from. We have these odd lines of scripture and all this religious iconography, and we have these sayings people use, but we don't entirely know where they come from, especially because of the many ways things can be changed, added to, removed, or lost in mythology. Earthsea and the Elder Scrolls is full of amazing stuff like this, and guess what? The Yukudans even have their own dead god called Sep, whose death is deeply tied to the creation of the mortal world. I focused on the dead god because it's such a powerful motif, but it is by no means the only one. There's the primordial waters, the global flood, the fall of man, mankind being created from clay, the war for creation, the great world serpent. The list is endless. These stories keep turning up in different mythologies, sometimes because they can reflect a shared historical experience, like some historians think the flood myth might be something like this, but sometimes because the metaphor itself is so evocative for the human experience. All life depends on water, so it's no surprise the primordial ocean keeps showing up. Think on how Gaiman describes the primordial waters in The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Like the dark seawater that laps beneath the wooden boards of an old pier, I would stay here for the rest of time in the ocean which was the universe, which was the soul, which was all that mattered. I saw the world from above and below, everything spoke to everything, and I knew it all. There's this deep sense of an unknowable infinite, of a depth from which all else rises, and in which we can lose ourselves. No wonder we compare it to space. But if we're thinking about world-building mythology, I think it's important to note that a lot of these motifs are specific to the Earth-human experience. Like in Dune, water is so precious the Fremen can barely conceive of an ocean, and water can hurt their godlike sandworms. In their world-building, the primordial sands might be more likely than the primordial ocean. So consider which experiences might be universal for your fictional species or civilization or planet, and which historical events might have been adapted into different religious stories to be remembered remembered in different ways. And while this creation myth about humans and fleas might have been about exploring our relationship with the divine, yours might be about something different, maybe about human nature. In Elden Ring, there's a creation myth that is aimed at explaining the problem of evil, of suffering, arguing that everything was once the same, all part of this thing called the One Great, but it was fractured into everything that is, and in being fractured came difference and identity, yes, but also suffering and sin. This fracturing theme is even echoed in the plot centered around the shattering of the Elden Ring. There's this constant sense of breaking down from something greater being the cause of suffering. Now, the second myth about humans being sculpted from mud or wood or yellow earth does something fascinating, but before I tell you about that, I need to tell you about something which is even more interesting. Today's sponsor, who is me! Look at me, look at me. I'm the sponsor now. Which is so damn cool to say, because I've been talking about world building and religion and mythology and fiction for years now, and I took all of the discussions that we've been having together and I put them into these easy to read, easy to reference books, which have thousands of extra words, tons of extra detail, and stuff that I could just never fit into these videos. Everything is expanded way bigger, deeper in these books. Way more accessible and easy to use when you're writing and world building, because sometimes videos aren't. Volume 3 is the best volume yet. I mean that like truly, genuinely, but all of them stand on their own. They cover completely separate topics, and so if you want, you can just pick the book that covers the topics you want to talk about. If it's anti-heroes or hard magic systems or polytheistic religions or world building cities or writing dialogue, they absolutely all work together. So you can pick up the entire set. Highly recommended. I've sold about 120,000 copies of these so far, which is amazing. Thank you. They're an incredibly important part of what I do. But of course, I am also an author. I've been publishing short stories and fiction and poems in magazines for a long while. And if you want to read those, some of them are down below. You can pick up my book, A Catalogue for the End of Humanity, where mythology actually plays a big part in some of these stories. If you like these videos, then there is literally nothing more on brand than these books that I can wholeheartedly get behind and recommend, and I'm so fortunate that I'm able to do that. Thank you for making it financially possible for me to sponsor my own stuff like this. It is not a dream, but a myth come true, you might say. So, this other myth speaks of the gods making humans from a bunch of stuff, but the nobles are made from yellow earth, while the peasants are made from red dirt. Why? Mythology is sometimes about philosophy, sometimes about history, but sometimes it's about politics. This is transparently trying to justify the social order, that the nobles are literally made from better quality stuff, so they deserve all the power and wealth. There's actually a really interesting version of this in Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives. This is in a world where people are divided by eye color into light eyes and dark eyes, with ranks like a caste system in between. The dominant religion, Varanism, has this whole theology, right? But part of it tries to explain away this caste system as natural. The light eyes are chosen by the Almighty to rule, and how they're always noble and just. Or there's another line saying, the better your blood is a light eyes, the more innate glory you had already. Just like that Chinese myth, the nobles are just made of better stuff, morally and physically, and I'm gonna bet that neither of these myths started like that. I know, this makes me sound conspiratorial, but this time the conspiracy's real. The curious thing is, in Stormlight, there is actually some historical basis for believing lighter eyes is somehow associated with power. I won't exactly spoil how that is, but it does show how history and metaphor can blur again, just in a different way, because politics can warp our understanding of both the metaphor and what it means, and what the history actually was. Is something part of the mythology because it's what people believed about themselves in the world, or is this version warped by other social factors, and do people start accepting that new narrative after a time like many Dark Eyes and Stormlight do? People try to force history to fit their theology, and your theology is shaped by your understanding of history, all of which can lead to some strange metaphors. So consider what phantom myths of previous beliefs might still be hanging around, and how different social factors might introduce new interpretations or change the original myths to fit something else. But this does hint at another reason that myths, especially creation stories, can sometimes end up being a little weird. Religious syncretism. This is where religions combine, mix their stories, characters, and therefore their metaphors and meaning. We like to think of mythology as the expression of like a single culture, a single story. Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, Norse mythology, especially when we're writing it, creating it for our stories. But no, this mixing happens all the time. Think of those Central and South American celebrations which blend Catholic and pre-Christian American imagery and beliefs. Dune does this with the Zenzuni Fremen, the Elder Scrolls does it all the time, Earthsea too, but when world building, it's fun to think of religious syncretism in terms of cultural exchange, I think, of trade routes and power dynamics. Syncretism might imply an extensive history of trade, like an Earthsea, happening organically, but it can also be calculated, it can be political. Maybe the powers that be want to integrate a people into their kingdom, and one way to do that is to say, hey, your religion can fit with ours, you can believe what you want, but it's gonna mix in, right? It's gonna mix in with ours somehow. Like in A Song of Ice and Fire, there's an Iron-born king who says, hey, the drowned god, he's an aspect of the stranger who's part of the faith of the seven, and that caused some conflict. How religions mix can explore the power dynamics between different groups of people, whose gods are reduced, whose stories are minimized. But if you're mixing characters and stories, then it can also muddy your metaphors. What does it mean to interpret all of the stories of the stranger through the light of the drowned god? What does it mean to blur the history of one with the metaphor of another? Some of the weirder elements of mythology might be attributed to religious syncretism that we don't even really know happened because it's so long ago. Bottom line, you end up with these three things in tension: real philosophical beliefs, history, and socio-political factors, what we can call layers of abstraction from the original story. Now, this is not to say the mythology becomes less real or authentic, because the changes to these stories can reflect real things, new beliefs, but it can explain some of these little quirks, which can do wonders for your world building. And this is to say nothing of whether the myths were taken down correctly or interpreted correctly or passed down right, which even in a fantasy world where the gods are definitively real would still happen. Sometimes the mythology is less important than the layers of abstraction which tell us about your world through how the myths are changed, obfuscated, minimized, expanded. The truth is, even in a fantasy book, mythology is still a story we tell about ourselves to ourselves, especially creation myths, and with that comes so much humanity. It's no wonder religious and mythological imagery shows up so much in sci-fi. These stories are deeply concerned with where we came from, what's our significance, what is the nature of reality and history. In Purgatory Mount, a future race of immortal, godlike humans come across a mountain in space built not unlike Dante's portrayal of Purgatory from the 14th century. The story asks, how do we atone for our sins when we have become technologically all-powerful and separated ourselves from death and pain? Or there's Ian M. Banks's Surface Detail, where there's this whole civilization who have built a digital artificial hell as a way to punish and control their population. Whether God or humanity creates such a place, the existential ethical questions remain the same. What is our relationship with this mortal world, and how should we rationalize good and punish evil? Mythological narrative tropes can bring thematic depth to your world building and characters, things like comparing people to Prometheus or a civilization to Atlantis, let's say. Other civilizations might mythologize us or our technology, or we mythologize them as a way of understanding them, in turn betraying an understanding of God or reality. In fact, there's a civilization in Purgatory Mount which does exactly that to these immortal humans. In the end, mythology is weird because people are weird, but it's also wonderful because people are wonderful. And even if we can't understand mythology as an easy bullet point list, we can in this video. First, myths aren't just attempts at pseudo-history. More importantly, they're about passing down a moral, social, or philosophical commentary. Second, motifs like the dead god, primordial waters, flood myth, and otherwise are often reflections of either a shared experience or some common touchstone. Even if they are an attempt at naturalism, these images can resonate with what it means to be human. Third, visceral metaphors can seem strange when we lack the full context to what they mean, historical, cultural, or otherwise. Disembodied myths can be a fascinating piece of world building. Fourth, myths can sometimes reflect political dynamics, justifying the social order or reinforcing a particular interpretation of history. This often happens with religious syncretism, but it can also muddy the metaphors and meaning even further. Fifthly, our theology impacts our understanding of history, and our history impacts our understanding of theology. And sixthly, science fiction features a lot of religious imagery in part because it seeks to answer the same questions. Mythological tropes can also add thematic depth to your world building, not just realism. Stay nerdy, grab my books, they're awesome, and I'll see you in the future. And as a reward for getting this far, this is Darcy. Say hello to Darcy. This is not my dog. I just lost my cat. But we are house sitting for someone. This is a very sweet dog who only ever wants cuddles and does that a lot. She's very, he's very sweet. Yes. Say hello, Darcy, in the comments. Come on, be a good comment farm for me. Be an engagement farm. That's what you're here for.